Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. Nutrient neutrality was one of Britain's key emerging natural capital markets, at least until a few weeks ago, when the government proposed changing the model to reduce pollution in Britain's waterways. Government had proposed plans to scrap EU-derived measures to reduce pollution through nitrogen and phosphorus credits paid by house builders to reduce nutrient loading elsewhere in a river catchment. They proposed replacing it with additional public funding, but with the responsibility for pollution reduction shifting from house builders to local authorities and to Natural England. The government was attempting to pass this legislation as an amendment to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. Well, that wasn't quite what happened, and I'm joined by two experts in the field to discuss what did. Jamie Evans-Freke is a partner within the Rural Consultancy Department at Knight Frank, and Gabriel Connor-Streich is the Chief Executive of Greenshank Environmental. Jamie, just what happened in Parliament this week?
Wow, well, what a roller coaster of a week. But following Gove's announcement on the 1st of August to remove nutrient neutrality, the discussion on the 4th of August, didn't seem to oppose much opposition from the Labour peers. And then on the 12th/13th of August, earlier this week, the motion on the fifth stage of a new bill coming through the Lords at the third reading, it was defeated by a number of peers rebelling against the notion of the taxpayer paying for nutrient offsetting as opposed to the developers themselves. So there are 353 votes, 192 against, 161 for, so a margin of 31 votes. It's about 9% of the House debating. The opposition was from a number of Conservative peers, the Liberal Democrats and Labour peers. So quite a few of the Tory peers rebelled against the notion that taxpayers should be picking up this tab.
Now, Jamie, you mentioned at the top there that, when this was first announced a month ago, there didn't seem to be a huge amount of concern about it, but that clearly changed. Do you get a sense of why it changed?
Yeah, it's interesting because Liz Truss about a year ago suggested removing nutrient neutrality as well, which put a bit of a pause on schemes. And now Gove as well is perceived to have been delaying planning permissions, etc., with the lack of mitigation schemes identified. I think we saw 3 or 4 years ago with nitrate offsetting. Initially, there weren't a lot of options, and as more came through, the value of the credits reduced significantly. And we're finding that with phosphate credits. There are only 27 schemes approved across the whole of England at the moment. As more proposals and solutions come forward, the value of the credits will drop. The private markets will correct themselves as more schemes come forward. The delays I'm experiencing are with the obtaining the Section 106 with the planning authorities rather than the concept of the schemes themselves.
Gabriel, I wonder if you could just talk us through some of the detail. What was the change that the government was proposing, and why was it so unpopular with people like yourselves working within the nutrient neutrality market and the public more broadly?
Yeah, so there were two key legislative changes that the government was proposing through amendments to the Levelling Up Bill. The first one, which probably got slightly less discussion, was a really quite sweeping change that would have effectively allowed the government, through making regulations, to change any act currently on the statute books in order to basically change the way in which nutrients are considered in relation to decision making. So effectively, it gave the government or a future government power to kind of say, oh, well, we don't really, well, you could probably say that the likely usage would be, we don't really like the way that nutrients are kind of holding something up, so therefore we can make regulations to remove this as a consideration in future decision making with respect to plans, projects, but probably various other things as well with respect to how the amendment was worded. I think probably the amendment that got a bit more kind of notice was the one that was basically worded in such a way as to say local planning authorities or other competent authorities, who are the ones that basically make the decisions under the habitat regulations, as to whether or not a plan or a project is going to potentially have a negative impact on a protected ecosystem. that those competent authorities were effectively instructed to ignore any evidence that nutrients may have an impact on those sites. And I think that was the part that really kind of raised a lot of eyebrows, because it, you're effectively telling decision makers to ignore evidence of something that could have an impact. I found it was quite interesting. I spoke to a barrister friend of mine who actually works in employment law. And he said he'd actually heard about this, because I think, it had raised so many eyebrows in the legal profession because of how sort of badly it was worded. He said, "Oh yeah, is that the amendment the government's putting forward? It's compelling local planning authorities to act irrationally." I think from a legal perspective, there was, it was so incendiary the way that particular amendment was worded. Obviously, that kind of really got a lot of people in the environmental sector going, okay, this is currently on a very specific issue, and none of us, I think, in the sector think that the way in which the current system is run is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. However, when you kind of go around telling people to ignore the evidence of impacts in order to just benefit a particular sector, like, that's a very, very big departure from the norms of environmental law and also just sensible decision making. So I think that was obviously something that was picked up a lot in the Lords debate on Wednesday. I think I was actually quite struck by the fact that I think probably given about equal weight in the Lords debate was the other bit, the sort of sweeping powers to make changes to acts of parliament that have some kind of relation to nutrients. I hadn't heard the phrase Henry VIII clause before, but heard that a lot, and it kind of makes sense as to, being able to just make these sweeping changes and suddenly just get rid of something on the statute books. And again, I think just how general that was, and how kind of, almost cynical it was to say, well, we just want to make this a possibility that we can kind of remove any issue that we might have in the future. It also really got a lot of the Lords kind of up in arms about it. So, again, this is a response to an issue with the way that the current system is working, which I think, as Jamie said, it's picking up speed. There are more and more schemes coming forward. There are lots of issues in terms of the speed in which schemes get approved, both with respect to Natural England and also local planning authorities, Section 106 agreements, the legal requirements for them. But the kind of government's response to that in terms of trying to just completely, sweep it all away was obviously the wrong way of trying to do this, and particularly the way they did it, got significant opposition. So I think, it's interesting. It shone a light on something that probably does need to change, but the way they went about it was clearly the wrong way, and hence it was defeated in the Lords.
Jamie, the nutrient neutrality market, as you said before, it is fairly new, as we've been discussing, and it was only really starting to take shape in Britain before the government just pulled the rug out from under it. How do you feel the market and the public responded to what the government was saying? I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but there has been quite an outcry from certain sectors, although, the Home Builders Federation seemed pretty happy about what the government was proposing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think we're dealing with a number of schemes at the moment, and we all at varying stages. And I think Natural England and the Environment Agency have had a really difficult task in making sure the schemes they approve are as bomb-proof as possible, and remove the opportunity for criticism in any subjectiveness in the delivery of the environmental improvement. So we've been working in collaboration with them on some of those schemes that really are just stopping a polluter, I say cautiously, but a sort of nutrient contributor into a special area of conservation, phosphates for freshwater, nitrates for saltwater ecology. And then once we've got that accredited, we're selling it to the open market once with the Section 106 in place. The market on two of the schemes I'm dealing with, the developers that were looking to get planning applications in between now and Christmas are still proceeding with purchasing credits. The developers that are looking at putting planning permissions in Q1, Q2 of 2024 was sort of sitting on the fence to see how this developed. I've got 4 calls today with some of those developers who are keen to purchase credits. So although this has been a distraction for the market, the planning authorities are still working with the current situation where they will be insisting on Grampian conditions that will require developers to purchase nutrient credits in these special areas of conservation, which is a European level of designation. So, freshwater stems with target species such as salmon, redshank, etc., they are going to require the developers to offset their pollution from the new development still. The market, with phosphates, it's still trading at quite a high level because there's on a huge amount of alternative options in each river stem. With nitrates, it has reduced significantly in the 3 years. It's dropped from about £70,000 a kilo to £2,500, between £1,500 and £2,500 per kilo. To put that in context, 1 kilo of phosphate is approximately 6 to 10 houses, discharged from 6 to 10 houses sewage. So yeah, the market's still on the coalface. We're doing deals, we're still trading. We were, even if this went through the House of Lords, we don't think, with the legal challenges that would be coming and really complicated issues such as trying to override the Habitats Directive, which would be a major issue for this going through. I don't think this has been researched properly by the government, because there would be all sorts of legal challenges coming if this had gone through. So we didn't think with a fair wind it would have been in place mid 2024, late 2024 at the earliest. Now it's been removed. We think that's likely to be removed for the short to medium term, but we'll see. But the public reaction was, I think, very anti the proposal, and rightly so, because I think the private sector, I think it's a good thing the private sector, the polluter is required to offset their negative contribution to the environment. And I think we're seeing this with developers with the BNG under the Environment Act. We're seeing it with water neutrality in certain areas, and phosphate neutrality and nitrate neutrality. I think that's it's a fledgling market. As more solutions come forward, it won't be as expensive for the developers. It's just gaining momentum. It would have undone a lot of good that the Natural England and Environment Agency have achieved over the last 24 months.
Gabriel, Jamie was saying there that the public were up in arms, and I mean, particularly the NGOs. And we spoke to Dieter Helm, who many would regard as the father of natural capital, in the last week or two. And his view, I think, was that, well, he was pretty cross with some of the language that had been coming out from the NGOs, but also his view was that, there were lots of different ways of skinning a cat. Were the NGOs right? Were the public right to be so upset?
I think, again, it comes back to the nature of what the government was proposing as to why the NGOs were really upset about this. I mean, I think, if there had been some form of a type of reform that even changed the way in which nutrient neutrality is kind of administered, there wouldn't have been anywhere near the level of pushback. But I think, again, it comes back to the fact that when you're telling people to ignore evidence of environmental impacts, instructing them in law to do that, like, you're inevitably going to come up against pretty significant, public anger about that, and especially at a time when, particularly sort of freshwater and coastal pollution is a big, a big issue in the public interest. So I think it was very, very badly played by the government. I think you asked a question about the Home Builders Federation. They seem pretty happy about what was proposed. I mean, of course they did. They've been rattling on this for the past 4 years, but particularly strongly for the past year or two. And it's their kind of view that this issue is completely intractable and should be completely removed because it's just a block on housing. I mean, as Jamie pointed out, there's more and more schemes coming forward. This is a market in its infancy. It takes time for a market to develop. And it's not true that there hasn't been any solutions being brought forward to this. As Jamie said that he's working on lots of trades for nutrient credits. The areas that have had this for the longest period of time are beginning to bring solutions forward. So I think you've kind of got this combination of, well, we know there is a way to deal with this in the right way, and the government just went about it completely in the wrong way, and in a way that was very, very incendiary. I think Jamie makes some really good points about the fact that this market really is beginning to pick up speed. I mean, certainly as somebody working to bring schemes forward, bring mitigation schemes to market, the big effect on this for us is for the past it's been about 8 weeks since the first briefing started showing up in the Times and Telegraph about government looking at a plan to scrap this, is that we've had to basically put we were proceeding cautiously, and we were really in the knowledge that a lot of the schemes that we were bringing forward kind of reaching the point where someone's going to have to start putting their hand in their pocket in a fairly serious way, and that was basically being massively held up. I think now we're going to be able to push forward with these schemes. We've got a lot more confidence that it's unlikely to come back in such a kind of nuclear way to just completely remove the requirements as to what happened. And I think there's going to be a much more of a sort of considered approach that will take into account probably the views of the NGOs, the fact that we do need to have a functional natural capital market solution to this, and probably some hybrid that is actually really the way forward.
Just before we sort of go on to what might happen next, you talked there about the way in which, the market isn't perfect in itself. And you yourselves, when it looked likely or possible at least that the amendment was going to go through, you at Greenshank Environmental put through proposals for a modification of the current market. I wonder if you could talk us through what those proposals were, whether they now sort of fall away because the amendment's been rejected, and also how the proposals were received.
Yeah, so we had kind of two different approaches. The first thing we started talking about as a possible alternative would be a really fundamental shift to the current way in which this nutrient neutrality is kind of administered, and that would be to remove it from the kind of purely sort of market-based system that we've got now, or where mitigation scheme providers bring credits forward. It's all kind of signed off by different people, different bodies, and then the credits are basically then available to be sold as a kind of commodity on the market. It would change it to be a levy-based system, so effectively that a price is set and a strategic scheme is administered at a catchment level, and that developers effectively just pay a fee at the point they get planning permission. And that fee goes into a pot of money that can then be used to buy mitigation from scheme providers who bring it forward, and therefore they know that there's money there to pay for those schemes. That would be we think probably potentially in the long term possibly the best way of kind of dealing with this. Obviously there are issues around what that starting sort of fee is, and how to make that representative of what it actually costs to produce mitigation. We think we can navigate that based on what we know about costs in the market at the moment, and have mechanisms by which the price of mitigation basically can go up and down depending on the costs for delivering that mitigation. So
does that proposal still have legs, do you think?
I think that proposal does have legs. The reason we kind of stepped away from it was because at the late stage that this was introduced into the Levelling Up bill, there just wasn't the time to have such a kind of full-featured change to or sort of amendment to an amendment being put into the bill. The way in which we actually ended up kind of working with Labour to help them to oppose the bill was by saying, actually, what we can do, we recognise that one of the biggest issues that developers have with this is the time it takes in order to get to discharge their requirements with respect to nutrients. It isn't necessarily, a lot of the developers we are working with have kind of come around to the idea that, there's a need for them to pay something, as Jamie said, to discharge their requirements with respect to, a form of pollution that results from building new houses. And it's really about the speed and the fact that they're currently in some places, because this has only been around for around a year in a lot of the catchments, it currently isn't a set of solutions available to help them through the problem. So we think that could be dealt with by virtue of changing, simple advice around the use of planning conditions. So at the moment, like most developers, regardless of where they are in the planning process, will have to have a mitigation solution. Even at outline planning, they have to have a mitigation solution to back up their outline planning application. And that means, and that might change a lot over the whole course of the planning process. The outline application might be quite different to the one that actually ends up going for detailed planning, and yet they still need to have some kind of mitigations, in place in order to secure that outline planning application. We think if you just push it to the end of the planning process, so either a pre-commencement or pre-occupation planning condition, that would enable developers to effectively move forward all the other things they have to do, and be able to progress through planning and then discharge their requirements with respect to nutrients at the end of the process. Now, we've had some interesting feedback from developers that having this kind of unknown amount of money that might be needed to discharge that condition at the end of a planning process, their planning process, makes it difficult for them to do the viability calculations as to whether or not they can actually bring a development forward. And that's why we came to a position with the NGOs that actually they would be happy, as the kind of people who might oppose something that would happen without having mitigation in place, with a situation in which, in really, in what we think will actually be very rare situations where, for whatever reason, no mitigation is available at the point where those conditions need to be discharged, there would effectively be a sort of one-off allowance for them to pay a compensation payment that would then go into a pot that would then buy mitigation when it does become available. Yeah. And that would basically mean that the developers have an ability to kind of have the confidence that they would be able to progress through the full planning process. I mean, again, the costs around what that would, how much that payment would have to be determined, but that seems to be a kind of more, that's a sensible middle ground approach, and actually doesn't require any legislative change to be able to do it.
Jamie, do you have any thoughts about that proposal?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting proposal, and it's similar to the Environment Act and Biodiversity net gain, where there's statutory credits and they've set that value now. As you were just alluding to there, the only difficulty is the cost of delivering the mitigation, because a lot of these people delivering the 26 schemes in place already with Natural England sign-off are successful businesses that are working within their license discharge amounts, and for them to surrender those discharge amounts, it sometimes involves closing down a business, so they need to be compensated for that, otherwise it won't happen. But I do think the positive thing of allowing the private markets to develop is that it's that the supply and demand will correct itself, as we've seen with the nitrate offsetting. They were trading at similar levels. Phosphate's trading between 65 and 75,000 pound a kilo at the moment, which is a big additional cost to house builders. It's between 7,000 and 10,000 pound per unit going on to their costs, like effectively a private environmental tax. But as we're seeing with the BNG markets, because they're being allowed to develop, it's trading significantly under the statutory amount. So that's the last resort, and more land's becoming available. So those credits, they were trading at 70, depending on your local planning authority, but between 35 and 40,000 pound per biodiversity credit. It's now trading between 15 and 23 and £1,000 per credit. So as more options come forward, the value of the credits will drop. So I'd be more in favour in allowing the private markets to develop and dictate value, and there's nothing preventing the developers delivering their own schemes on land in the same catchments if the market got out of control. But I think the blockage and an area of improvement I can see is if there was some leasing mechanisms introduced, which was being promised in the Environment Act, but haven't developed yet. So we're still having to use Section 106 agreements for BNG units. Here, we're having to use voluntary Section 106 agreements in the absence of any other legal mechanism being available. So there's talk of conservation covenants, etc., being introduced. But I think that could be a positive thing that the government could introduce, maybe. But the main blocker for me has been the time it's taking to get Section 106 agreements agreed, and then the necessary Section 53 agreements to put those requirements of a Section 106 in other planning authorities downstream from where our schemes are, or upstream, depending on what the scheme is. But yeah, it's an interesting concept, and indeed what's been happening for the biodiversity credits, and that's working. So I just think the value of that statutory credit would have to sort of account for people being compensated enough to shut down a business or reduce production of a certain product significantly to surrender their discharge license.
Gabriel, I know that you've been working with the Labour Party on how they're going to oppose the amendment. The amendment has been rejected. Do you think it's going to come back as a separate bill in the King's Speech on the 7th of November? Or is that it? Is it gone?
I think if they do bring anything back, it won't be anywhere near as kind of radical as what they were just defeated on, because they ultimately were handed quite a bad bloody nose on that, and I think they would probably, if they tried to just bring back something very similar, sweeping it aside without any kind of sensible replacement, then yeah, I think the same thing would happen again. So I think there might be some form of change, but we're hopeful now that that can be a more considered change, and with the required work being done to underpin whatever the new mechanism is. I think one of the interesting things that happened with this is the government kept on referring to this additional money they were putting in, which wasn't actually enough to cover anywhere near enough to cover the requirements for nutrient mitigation over the next 7 years. And then talking a lot about how the wastewater treatment works upgrade program would then sort of solve the problem, and actually neither of those things were true. So there was never the work done to figure out whether or not the wastewater treatment works upgrades actually dealt with the problem fully, or if it just was dealing with the impacted baseline that has caused this problem in the first place. And as I said, there wasn't enough money there to fund the amount of mitigation that's required anyway, and that money, because they took away the requirement for developers to actually pay for it, wasn't then going to be a kind of self-funding mechanism to continually bring more mitigation forward. So I think those things will be true if they just try and bring in another bill that will effectively just remove it without a replacement again. So I think whatever comes next is likely to have to be a lot more sensible and a lot less just done to suit one side of the debate.
Thanks, Gabriel. We're starting to run out of time, but Jamie, just finally, I think looking forward, it feels like this whole debacle has been pretty catastrophic. And surely confidence in the nutrient neutrality market has been seriously undermined as a result, just as happened with solar energy back in 2015. Do you think that the market can recover before there's an election and a possible change of government? I mean, really, what I'm saying is, will the market just be too nervous of what might happen in the interim to be able to act?
Well, I think, look, developers are not going to sit around waiting on the big schemes they've got in place, and they weren't, even if this came through. As I said earlier, anyone wanting to get a planning application over in the next 3 months was still buying credits, even if this act came in. But I think the confidence in the whole scheme is still there. It's a requirement. The developers would, of course, prefer it not to be there, but it's there, and it's there to stay. And I think the proposals for water companies to reduce their legal level of pollution has been reduced eightfold by 2030. So they've got between now and 2030 to deliver on that. And if they've got more than 2,000 houses discharging into their sewage works, they've got to deliver on-site solutions. So this market is really only here between now and 2030, because in theory, the water companies should deliver beyond that. Let's wait and see. I think the cost implications for the water companies to deliver that are huge, and that may be difficult. How are they going to pay for that? It's probably going to come through in water charges, sewage charges, which might not be politically acceptable, and so there might need to be some form of funding from the government there. But I think in the interim, between now and 2030, the developers, the private market, at least maintain the level of the water quality as a minimum. We've seen with biodiversity net gain, there's a 10% improvement required. I think environmentally focused parties could suggest that there's some betterment element in this, but that's going the other way. But I think the house builders are cracking on. The ones I'm dealing with, they've got it budgeted, they're ready to go. They're wanting planning applications in now, not in a year's time. The smaller 1-house, 5-house developers may well wait and see, but we're not going to suddenly see no developers putting planning applications in for a year while they see what the politicians want to sort of propose.
Gabriel, a final quick last thought. An unfortunate blip, but life goes on.
Yeah, I think, like Jamie just said, we're now confident that we can progress with the schemes that we're looking at. I think our clients are going to have a lot of confidence now that this was kind of the worst assault we're likely to see, and we survived it. So this is likely to be around now in some form or other for the foreseeable future. So I think, I think there will be some nervousness still, but hopefully a lot more confidence in the market now, and I wouldn't be surprised if we're able to progress our schemes, rapidly as people. There's a whole lot more focus on this issue now than there was about 3 weeks ago. So I think hopefully that will also help to really boost the other things that need to happen. As Jamie mentioned, Section 106 agreement, streamlining that whole process, streamlining Natural England's approval. These things need to happen to make this all work faster. And hopefully now, with the spotlight that we've got that will happen.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That's been fascinating, but we're out of time. I'd like to thank my guests, Gabriel Connor-Streich from Greenshank Environmental and Jamie Evans-Freke from Knight Frank. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.